Uh, Hello, class, and welcome to week 8. Today we are going to pause our discussion of content and we are going to talk about writing. I'm sorry my screen is recording blurry. I'm not sure what's going on with the lighting in here, but that my words are what's more important and less my blurry face. I'm going to go through some do's and don'ts for writing as well as highlight some things for your paper that you need to remember. Um, and then I highly recommend that you go ahead and get your notebook out and that you take notes on this section. You will need to refer back to them. Of course, you'll have this video to come back on at your leisure, but I really recommend that you write notes so that you can keep them in front of you when you're writing. So first thing, I want to highlight the assignment, the final paper. You're going to write a 6 page, and I mean 6 pages. You have a couple of line leeway on to be short, and a cup on page 5, and a couple of line leeway to be over on page 7. Or sorry, you have a couple of lines. Like you can be a couple of lines on page 6, not page 5. If you turn in 5 pages, you're gonna have a bad time. But on the 6th page, you can come up a couple of lines short of the end, and on you can go a couple of lines onto page 7. These this page range needs to include your citations. If you choose we'll talk about citations, but you're not going to do in-text citations. You're going to do either endnotes or footnotes. And depending on how you do them will depend on whether or not you're allowed to have a notes page that doesn't count towards those 6. If you do endnotes, it'll shove all your citations to the end of the paper, and you'll have a page at the end that can be your 7th page, where all your notes will exist. But other than that, you've got 6 pages of text that you have to arrive on, and you are doing a literature review. This means that you're going to choose a topic. You've already turned in your first video reflection, and you've already kind of determined, I'm going to adjust this just a little bit. Maybe that'll help. I can see the color gradient fading in and out back here. You've already done your video reflection, which means you've already um, kind of suggested a paper topic, and I'll once you've had that kind of like greenlit by me, you can begin writing your proposal and go forward. But you're going to take that paper topic, you're going to explore in graphic novel sources. And remember, those don't have to be US based superhero stories. They can be manga, they can be foreign comics, they can be whatever, as long as it has a graphic novel format. And you're going to take those sources and you're going to analyze them and tell me your argument isn't going to be whether or not your topic is good or bad, or there's no call to action for the end of your at the end of your paper for someone to do something about your topic. But what you're doing is you're gonna take literature and you're gonna review it and you're gonna tell me whether or not that literature is well written, poorly written, realistic, unrealistic, those kind of things. Um, the reason I have you do this type of assignment is when I got into grad school for history, I didn't know how to write one of these. And one of my first days in grad school, I got an assignment back with a D on it, a 2 page literature review. And it said, "What the fuck is this? Come see me in my office." And I went to my instructor's office, who I didn't know very well, and was kind of offended. And he was like, "Hey, you can't write like this. This isn't acceptable." And we spent several hours correcting my writing, and it was something no one had ever taught me how to do. And I always swore then that because I wasn't trained to do it and then was expected to do it as a grad student, I was at a really big disadvantage. And I always swore that if I had the opportunity, I would um, make sure that my students knew how to do it. And so that's why I've been doing this version of the assignment. So 6 page literature review, you pick the topic, you're going to find 2 or 3 graphic novel stories to analyze, and you're going to dig in. So let's start with the things you shouldn't do. First, ironically, is you should not write in first person. No I, no we, none of that. There has been a trend in high school level writing where instructors for some reason have encouraged students to try to find their voice through writing in the first person, and that's not really appropriate in academic writing, with very few exceptions. It's great for for prose writing, right? For fiction writing, and it's even great for certain types of writing in the STEM field where you're kind of required to explain the steps you took during a experiment, right? If you work on a team, you're going to say we a lot. Um, but for this paper, you're just not going to say it. You're going to be tempted to refer to your own research. You don't need to do that. You can say things like this project shows or this project examined, but again, that's clunky and isn't really necessary when you can just dive right into what you have to say. Um, so obviously, then you're going to write in the third person, and you're going to write in kind of a third person omniscient form, where you're this disembodied analyzer. A couple of notes about the structure of the paper as you're writing it is it should have a really dynamic introduction. And the best way you can get a dynamic introduction is to retell a key scene from one of your graphic novels that you're going to analyze. So, for instance, we've talked about The Killing Joke a couple of times. If I were going to write a paper about violence against women or fridging, which is one of the topics we talked about, and it's totally a thing you can choose for your final paper, I would start by dramatically retelling the opening Killing Joke, something along the lines of it's deep at night in the city of Gotham. A young librarian sits down for coffee with her father to look at old photographs and reminisce, a trip down memory lane. While sitting there, she hears a knock at the door. She gets up, and when she opens the door, staring back at her is the face of a bone white killer. A blast of noise and a searing pain as she tumbles back through the as she tumbled back through the glass. And as she lay there, she wondered, what's going to happen to me? That's how I might start it. It's important to remember this brings us to the next thing then, right? So you're going to have to write in the third person. You're also going to write in a past tense when referring to events that take place in comic books. Any event you're going to write about, right, is going to be in the past tense because it already happened, right? When I'm talking about the events of Killing Joke, that happened in 1985, right? That's almost a 40-year-old graphic novel. That's an old story. And so you're going to write if you're talking about Spider-Man, it's going to be Peter Parker did this, right? It's not going to be he does this. He leaps over the building. He leapt over the building, right? So that's what you got to keep in mind. So writing in the third person and the past tense when you're describing events in comics. Now, if you want to do a more contemporary analysis of the impact, then you can switch in that space, you can switch into a more present tense. Uh, and you might even speculate on its continued impact. If you have a really powerful or a newer graphic novel, you could speculate on its impact. But what you can't do is write in the present tense about events in your graphic novel. That just does not jibe. When you're writing, you're going to want to avoid contractions. Don't, didn't, wasn't. Needs to be did not, could not, would not. Contractions are just kind of a vulgar, in quotes. When I say vulgar language, I mean low or underclass or basically non-academic writing. And there's plenty of reasons why you would write like that in other genres. But for academic writing and especially a literary analysis, you're not going to use contractions. They're also sometimes a handy tool to keep your word count down, but you've got to learn to write without them. And so that's my expectation is that you don't use them for this paper. Uh, a huge pet peeve of mine. So the next thing is parenthetical asides. I graded your first writing responses, and I noticed a couple of you used these in your first writing responses. I didn't mark you down for your Young Justice writing responses, but you can't use them in your paper. Now, an aside is when you kind of do this thing while talking, right? Uh, it's when you add either clarifying or extra non-connected information inside of to the audience, and then a parenthetical asides just means that that appears inside of parentheses. You won't have parentheses appear in your paper at all unless they're a part of a quote. And I'll get to the citation stuff in a minute. But an aside is in academic writing is a useless. rhetorical device. It doesn't have a place. If you're saying something and it's important enough for you to say, put it in the body of your paper and make it a direct statement. Parenthetical asides are also a no-no, right? Going back to that first person, because that's a thing that a narrator does, right? Puts an extra piece of information. Oh, hey, also, did you notice this thing? You're as kind of an analyzer, right? As a third person omniscient analyzer, you're not going to give the audience extra pieces of information. It doesn't fit there. If it's not important enough for you to say in the body of the paper, like if it feels like it needs an aside, just don't say it. Just drop that piece of information entirely. And that can help with the editing process, kind of weeding those out. But yeah, no parenthetical asides. They're absolute, they're absolutely not appropriate for this type of writing. You'll see them sometimes in especially first person fiction writing, if you've got a narrator. I don't know if any of you have read the Dresden Files, but uh, they're narrated by the first person, by the main character, right? He's telling you a story. You'll often find them in there. They're also present in Shakespeare, asides in particular, right? Where a character will break off and address the audience directly. That's an aside. There's no need for them in this paper, so don't use them. The other really big thing that you have to be careful about is how you use quotation marks. Quotation marks are used for exactly two things. One, they go around the title of minor works, and two, they go around direct quotations. They do not go around words for emphasis. They do not go around words to identify sarcasm. They just don't. Their only purpose in writing is for quotation marks or to set off a minor work. Now, you might be asking, what's a minor work? This goes into my next thing, which is italics. Italics go around are used for the titles of major works. So a good way to separate them is song title, album title, right? Uh, if it's an album title, right, it'll be in italics, and individual song titles will be around in quotation marks. Same thing with a TV show versus a TV episode. So, for instance, it's really popular. I don't care for Friends, but Friends will always be in italics, and then the one where or the one that would always be in quotes if you were going to list them out. So for your papers, major franchises are always in italics. So Batman, Superman, Detective Comics, Action Comics, Sensational Comics, those things are all in italics. And then individual issues would be in quotes. So I know we've talked about a couple of significant individual issues. If you're writing about addiction, uh, Snowbirds Don't Fly, which is an issue of Green Arrow, Green Lantern. Green Arrow, Green Lantern in italics, Snowbirds Don't Fly in quotation marks for the individual issue. If you're using a volume like we did for Young Justice, where you wouldn't necessarily quote the individual issue, like you're not holding a single issue of comics, then just referring to the volume title for the whole graphic novel is fine, and that would be in italics in its entirety. Young Justice Volume 1 would be in its italics in its entirety. The other things italics do are mark foreign words. So if you have a word that is not in English, so if you're using a Japanese or a French or Mexican or any other country's graphic novels and it's not in English, you can put phrases or words that don't translate well in italics. And the other thing they do is mark slurs and other vulgar language. So, for instance, if you're writing about racism and you're using an X-Men story and you want to use the word mutie, you would do that in italics, just in general. Don't put those things in quotes. That's not where they go. It's not what they're for. They go in italics. Things you wouldn't say as a human, but are important for you to include in academic writing, go in italics. Um, Obviously, and I'm going to say this here, and I don't expect anyone would do this, but I want to say this here, just using italics does not give you free rein to just use racial slurs in your writing. Not that I assume any of you would do that, but it's important for me to say. But if it's important for the content of your paper, especially in the context of, the slurs that are hurled at comic book characters, then that's how you would write them. That's what italics are for. So again, quotes, not for emphasis. They're not for sarcasm. They're not to mark something you wouldn't say. They are only to directly quote someone or talk about the title of a minor work. Don't use them for anything else. And a good way for you after you've written your paper, if you're worried you might write that might have used them, is just Control F and look for quotation marks in your paper. Control F is a find function inside of Word. That also works for your contractions if you're looking for them. You can do N apostrophe T, and that should find all of your contractions. It should also work for parentheses. If you're worried that you've written that way and you want to be extra certain, you can just Control F and find all of them. Speaking of Control F, another word you should look for and delete from your writing is the word vary. Uh, what you want to do instead of using the word vary is use dynamic language. So instead of using the phrase like very tall, you would use huge, or instead of saying very tired, you would use exhausted, or very hungry, you would use ravenous. You always want to use the best dynamic word. Very is one of those things that's just kind of a bad adverb and it's lazy. And instead, you can really punch up your writing and create a great cadence and display your use of language by getting rid of it and using better words. You probably want to use about, I obviously haven't read much of any of your writings. I've only read one thing at this point, but if I can kind of judge based on trends, you're going to all want to use about half the adverbs that you normally do. So looking for ly also is a great way to look at ways you can reduce your word count and oftentimes adverbs aren't needed. Only use them when they're necessary, otherwise they lose their punch. So um, let's see. We've covered person, parenthetical asides, contractions, tense, quotation marks. Here's the other thing about quotation marks. Unless you're using them to quote a title, you always need to cite what comes after them. If you're doing dialogue or a direct quote from any source, it doesn't just have to be your comics, it could be any of your sources from any point in your paper. What you really need to do is make sure that they are uh, um, cited. And so the citation methods you're going to use are either foot or endnotes. You get to choose. One or the other, don't mix them. I do not want to see a single MLA style in-text citation. Now, that's confusing, and I understand that because you're required to use MLA for the rest of your paper. MLA is a garbage format as far as I'm concerned. I would much rather have you use APA for the whole thing. But because we're trying to be in line with the English department and they want you to use MLA, we're doing it here. So you only have to learn one of those before you go off into your disciplinary lens courses. So instead, MLA has this weird little hitch that says, like, yeah, you can totally use footer endnotes. Just pick somebody else's formatting and use those. And so I would recommend that you use APA's footer endnote, and they have a preference for endnote. I have a preference personally for footnotes, but that's because I'm a historian and that's Chicago style. It is what historians have to use, so it's what I was trained in. If you want to use Chicago and get extra bonus brownie points for me and learn a kind of niche style, you can. But I would recommend APA. It's what most of you will use in your majors moving forward. If you're in the medical field, if you're in most STEM programs, if you're in most social sciences, all of you are going to use APA as opposed to like Chicago or MLA going forward. And that should be most of the majors in class. So I highly recommend that you use those. And then again, you get to choose footer endnotes. To do them in Word, it's really easy. Type a sentence. At the end of that sentence, after punctuation, click up along the top to the reference tab. If you want to open Word and follow along to this point, click references and insert footnote. And you can then turn that into an endnote if you want to. Footnotes are consecutive, right? So they always count up and they never repeat. So it doesn't matter how many times you cite a specific source, you're always going to get a new number when you cite them. Same thing for endnotes. Do not mess around and try to put them in manually in the footer. If you start messing with the footer in your by like clicking down at the foot of your paper, you're gonna have a bad time because you're not gonna make them look properly. Use the reference tab. Use the reference tab. If you have problems getting that formatted, you can always go see a reference librarian, or the writing center, and they can show you how to put them in there. But again, it's super easy. Just at the top of Word, click reference. It'll be here-ish, and insert footnote. Easy peasy, one, two, three, easy. And then follow your citation guide for how to cite those out. I highly recommend for your style guides, you use the Purdue's online writing lab or the OWL, and you can just Google Purdue OWL, and you'll have all the writing guidelines you need at your fingertips. Um, while you're writing, there will be a draw, a pull for you to write the way you speak. And for the most part, that's fine. It gives you your voice, it gives you like tone and intonation, those kind of things. It also, however, opens you up to some bad habits. And one of those bad habits is a setup question. This is where also I think quotes for emphasis came from, right? If you're giving a speech and you want to denote with your hands that you're being sarcastic, right? You put air quotes around a thing so that your audience can see visually that you're doing a thing, right? It's part of the bit, it's part of being entertaining. So I think that bled into writing. The other thing I think that's bled into writing is a setup question. If you're doing your introduction and you're like, this begs the question, where was Batman? That's great in a speech because you have a whole room full of people who are going to see you ask this question and they're going to think about it and you're going to see that they're thinking about it and you're going to be able to use that as like energy to go forward. In a paper, it's a waste of space. Unless you have some kind of writing, again, STEM is almost always the exception, but unless you have some kind of writing that requires you to list out the questions you asked and then answer them one at a time, something like that, or you have a section that's dedicated to these were the questions I used for my experiments, or this was the big question that I worked around. Putting a question in your paper that's directed at the reader is a waste of time, and it's a rhetorical device that does not land because no one can answer you. If you were in a speech and you asked a question, you might expect to get a couple of answers and move on. Same thing with stand-up comedians who ask questions of their audience. With a paper, you're having me read it weeks after you wrote those lines for the first time, maybe even a month if you're ahead of things. I'm not going to be able to answer those questions. And so if you have a question that's directed at the audience, just delete that. Some people think it's stylistic. It's really just a waste of time and it frustrates your reader because they're like can't engage with you. And instead, just tell us what you want to say, right? That's extra space you can use to shore up your arguments or give us another example of what you mean. That covers, let's see, person, tense, parenthetical sides, contractions, setup questions, citation format. Again, every time a pair of quotes exists, requires a note. So if you're quoting anything that's not your own words or your own idea, you need to footnote or endnote it. In addition to that, if you're summing up something that's not yours as well, or if you're saying this author agrees with me and kind of hears what they said and you're paraphrasing instead of quoting directly, you still need to foot or endnote that. If you don't, that's an academic dishonesty violation. So hear me now. It's better to oversight than undersight, and it will always be to your benefit to list the source more often than you think you need to. You can get in trouble that way if you're not careful. Using better words and then what italics are for. Okay, so that covers everything I wanted to talk about today. It's going to be a shorter, obviously a much shorter lecture than you're used to sitting through. Um, Watch this, read through the rubric because there's a question from the rubric as well on the quiz. Take that quiz, and then that's, what we're covering today. And then just make sure that you're implementing these things going forward in your process. This is universal advice. So unless you have an instructor that specifically told you to not do one of the things that I've talked about or do one of the things I said you shouldn't, this is advice you should follow for all of your writing. All of your academic writing should be formatted this way. You should never use quotes for emphasis in any of your writing. And this is going to help you get better, and I'm going to help you going to help you wean it out. Ah, yes, sorry, I forgot one last thing. We should talk about passive voice. The hardest thing for me as an academic, and it's going to be the hardest thing for you too, is to get passive voice out of your writing. What's passive voice, you say? It's, see what I did there with the setup question? Passive voice is anytime you take the responsibility for an action off of the thing that did it. So this is an imperfect example, but it's a really clear one, and it actually highlights the difference between Spanish and English. In Spanish, when you're formulating your sentences versus English, you wouldn't say, I broke my arm. You would actually say, my arm broke on me, right? My arm broke. I didn't break it. That's passive voice in English. So another example of passive voice is a counterfactual. I would have, but is an excuse, right? And it's a counterfactual. Well, you didn't. So instead of saying, well, I would have, but you need to say, I didn't because that's taking responsibility. So when you're writing in your paper, get those would haves, could haves, should haves. And in fact, if it's paired like that, it's almost guaranteed to be passive voice. There's other forms of passive voice, but what you want to do when you're reading your sentences is just to make sure is the subject taking responsibility for the action. And if that's a yes, then you're probably not in passive voice, you're in active voice. Not only will that trim down your word count and give you more room to make your argument, it'll also make your writing more dynamic, and it will not sound wishy-washy. The other thing you can tell is if you're reading a paragraph and you're like, wow, this sounds really wishy-washy. It doesn't sound like anyone's taking a stance on anything. It's probably because it's riddled with passive voice. So really, really, really work on writing in active voice. That will be the number one hardest thing for you to do as you're finding your own flair and format as an author, and it'll also to be the thing that benefits you the most. If you can get a handle on getting passive voice out of your writing, you'll be double the writer tomorrow you are today. So good luck. Again, any questions, put them in the discussion group or send me an email and I'll try to answer them. If I get a couple of people email me the same question, I'll just make a post in the announcements page. Good luck in your writing, and I will see you next time.